When a billionaire father witnesses his disabled son being asked to dance by a kind-hearted waitress, the moment shatters years of barriers, igniting a transformation that redefines love, acceptance, and what it means to truly live. The marble. Floors of Montgomery Industries gleamed under crystal chandeliers, reflecting the cold perfection that Richard Montgomery had built around himself. At 52, he commanded an empire worth $3 billion, his steel gray hair perfectly styled, his Italian suits tailored to hide the weight of isolation he carried. The corner office on the 42nd floor offered a view of the city he helped shape, but tonight, the lights below seemed more distant than ever. "Mr. Montgomery, the car is ready," his assistant announced through the intercom. Richard glanced at his Rolex, 7:30 p.m. Another late night, another dinner postponed with his 16-year-old son, Michael. The boy had Down syndrome, a fact that Richard struggled to reconcile with his image of perfection. He loved Michael deeply, but that love was buried beneath layers of professional obligations and social expectations. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The drive to the exclusive Riverside Country Club took 20 minutes through tree-lined streets where every house cost more than most people's lifetime earnings. Richard had chosen this restaurant for its privacy, its impeccable service, and its clientele, people who understood the burden of wealth and the necessity of maintaining appearances. Tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight he had promised Michael a father-son dinner, just the two of them. Michael was already waiting in the lobby, his face lighting up with pure joy when he saw his father. Despite his challenges, or perhaps because of them, Michael possessed an emotional honesty that both touched and unsettled Richard. The boy wore his best suit, carefully selected by their housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, and his excitement was palpable. "Dad, I've been waiting. They have music tonight. Live music." Michael's enthusiasm was infectious, though Richard felt the familiar tug of embarrassment as other patrons glanced their way. He'd spent years teaching Michael to speak more quietly in public, to draw less attention to his differences. The maitre d' led them to Richard's usual table, tucked in a corner where business could be conducted in private. The Riverside Club's dining room was a testament to old money, dark wood paneling, oil paintings of long-dead industrialists, and the soft murmur of conversations about stock portfolios and charity galas. This was Richard's world, ordered and predictable. But tonight felt different. A small jazz ensemble had set up near the bar, and couples were beginning to move onto the parquet dance floor. Michael's eyes were wide with wonder as he watched the musicians tune their instruments. "Dad, can we dance later? Mrs. Chen taught me some steps." Richard's jaw tightened. Dancing would draw attention, create a spectacle. "We'll see, son. Let's order first." He signaled their waitress, a young black woman whose name tag read Diane. She approached with professional courtesy, but Richard noticed something else in her demeanor, genuine warmth as she looked at Michael. Diane Johnson was 26, working her way through nursing school while supporting her younger brother. She'd seen her share of entitled, wealthy patrons, but something about the boy's innocent excitement touched her heart. When Michael struggled to pronounce some items on the menu, she didn't rush him or show impatience. Instead, she knelt beside his chair, making gentle suggestions and laughing at his jokes. "Your son has wonderful energy," Diane told Richard as she finished taking their order. "It's refreshing to see someone so genuinely happy." Richard nodded curtly, uncomfortable with the personal nature of the comment. He wasn't used to staff members speaking so familiarly, especially about Michael. As dinner progressed, the jazz ensemble began their first set. The saxophone's sultry notes filled the air, joined by the gentle brush of drums and the walking bass line. Michael's foot began tapping under the table, his head swaying slightly to the rhythm. Several couples had moved to the dance floor. Their movements elegant and practiced. Dad, listen, it's Moon River. That's one of Mrs. Chen's favorites. Michael's voice carried more than Richard would have liked, earning glances from nearby tables. He felt the familiar heat of embarrassment rising in his cheeks. Why couldn't Michael just sit quietly like other teenagers? Diane approached to refill their water glasses, and she noticed Michael's obvious love for the music. "Do you like to dance?" she asked him directly, ignoring Richard's disapproving look. Michael's face lit up like Christmas morning. "I love dancing. Mrs. Chen taught me the waltz and the foxtrot. She says I'm a natural." His pride was evident, and Diane found herself smiling despite Richard's obvious discomfort. She could see the tension in the father's shoulders, the way he seemed to shrink every time his son spoke above a whisper. The music shifted to a slower song, and more couples joined the dance floor. Michael watched with longing, his fingers drumming the table in perfect time with the music. Richard noticed his son's yearning and felt a familiar stab of guilt. How many times had he denied Michael simple pleasures out of his own discomfort? "Excuse me," Michael said, his voice barely containing his excitement. "I need to use the restroom." Richard nodded, watching his son navigate between tables with the careful determination that characterized everything Michael did. The boy had learned to move through the world with extra caution, knowing that his differences made him a target for stares and whispers. While Michael was gone, Richard found himself studying the dance floor with new eyes. He saw elderly couples moving with practiced grace, young lovers lost in each other's eyes, and middle-aged pairs finding joy in simple movement. When had he stopped seeing the beauty in such moments? When had everything become about image and control? Diane returned to check on them, noticing Michael's empty chair. "Restroom," Richard explained, then found himself adding, "He loves music. Always has, since he was small." It was more personal information than he'd shared with anyone outside his family in years. "Music is a universal language," Diane replied, refilling his coffee. "It speaks to parts of us that words can't reach. Your son seems to understand that instinctively." Her words carried no judgment, only observation, but they struck Richard like a physical blow. When had he stopped listening? "To that universal language?" Michael returned, his eyes immediately drawn to the dance floor where a new song had begun. Something with a gentle, swaying rhythm that seemed to call to him. He sat down but couldn't stop moving to the music, his whole body alive with the desire to dance. "Dad," Michael said, his voice small but hopeful, "would you dance with me? Just one song." The request hung in the air between them, heavy with years of similar moments. Moments when Richard had chosen his own comfort over his son's happiness. He looked around the dining room, acutely aware of the other patrons, the potential embarrassment, the whispers that would follow. "Michael, this isn't the place. These people don't—" He stopped himself, but the damage was done. Michael's face fell, the light in his eyes dimming like a candle in the wind. The boy nodded, understanding, flooding his features along with disappointment he tried hard to hide. Diane witnessed this exchange from across the room, and something inside her shifted. She'd seen too many moments like this in her life. Moments when love was overshadowed by fear, when connection was sacrificed for appearance. She made a decision that would change everything. Approaching their table during a break between songs, Diane looked directly at Michael. "You know what? I love this next song they're about to play. Would you do me the honor of being my dance partner?" Her voice was gentle but confident, offering an invitation without pressure. Michael's eyes widened in disbelief and joy. "Really? You want to dance with me?" Richard opened his mouth to object, but Diane's gaze stopped him cold. There was something in her expression, a challenge perhaps, or maybe just simple human decency, that made him pause. Part 6. The Dance That Changed Everything. Before Richard could voice his objections, Michael was on his feet, offering his arm to Diane with the old-fashioned courtesy Mrs. Chen had taught him. "It would be my pleasure, ma'am," he said, his formal politeness bringing tears to Diane's eyes. She took his arm, and together they walked to the dance floor as the band began a gentle swing number. What happened next would replay in Richard's mind for years to come. Instead of the awkward, embarrassing scene he'd feared, he watched his son transform into someone he'd never truly seen before. Michael led Diane onto the floor with confidence, his movements careful, but surprisingly graceful. Mrs. Chen had indeed taught him well. The other dancers seemed to sense something special happening. Rather than staring or whispering, they gave Michael and Diane space, some even smiling encouragingly. Michael's face was radiant with pure joy as he guided Diane through the steps, his concentration complete, his happiness infectious. Diane was amazed by Michael's natural rhythm and the gentle way he led her through the dance. Despite his disability, or perhaps because of the way he experienced the world more intensely, he seemed to feel the music in every cell of his body. His joy was so pure, so unguarded, that it began to affect everyone around them. "You're a wonderful dancer," Diane told him as they swayed together, and Michael's smile could have powered the entire restaurant. Mrs. Chen was right. "You are a natural." Other couples began to join them on the floor, but Michael and Diane remained the center of attention, not because they were different, but because their joy was simply irresistible. Richard sat frozen at their table, watching his son in a completely new light. For the first time, he wasn't seeing Michael's disability or worrying about what others thought. He was seeing his son, truly seeing him as a complete person with talents, grace, and a capacity for joy that Richard had somehow forgotten or chosen to ignore. Tears began to stream down Richard's face as he watched Michael spin Diane gently, both of them laughing at something she'd whispered. The other diners weren't staring in horror or embarrassment. They were smiling, some even applauding softly. An elderly woman at a nearby table dabbed at her eyes with her napkin, clearly moved by the scene. "Beautiful, isn't it?" said a voice beside him. Richard turned to see Dr. Patricia Hernandez, a prominent pediatrician he knew from various charity events. She'd approached his table and was watching the dance with obvious delight. "Your son is remarkable. The way he moves, the way he connects with his partner. That's not something you can teach. That comes from the heart." Richard could only nod, his throat too tight for words. Dr. Hernandez continued, "You know, in my practice, I see a lot of parents struggle with accepting their children's differences, but the ones who learn to see past the disability to the person underneath, those families find a kind of joy that the rest of us can only imagine." As the song ended, Michael and Diane remained on the floor, both breathing lightly from the exertion, but glowing with happiness. The other diners began to applaud, not condescendingly, but with genuine appreciation for the beauty they'd witnessed. Michael took a small bow, then guided Diane back toward their table with the same careful courtesy he'd shown all evening. "Dad, did you see? Did you see me dance?" Michael's excitement was boundless as he returned to the table, his face flushed with happiness and pride. Diane smiled at Richard, but there was something in her expression, a quiet challenge perhaps, or maybe just hope. "I saw, son. You were—" Richard's voice caught, and he had to clear his throat before continuing. "You were magnificent." The word seemed to surprise him as much as it did Michael, but he realized it was absolutely true. His son had been magnificent, not, despite his disability, but as a complete person expressing joy in its purest form. Diane excused herself to attend to other tables, but not before squeezing Michael's hand. "Thank you for the dance. You made my evening special." As she walked away, Richard called after her, "Miss Diane." Thank you. That was very kind of you." His words felt inadequate, but Diane nodded with understanding. She'd seen the change beginning in his eyes, the first cracks in the wall he'd built around his heart. The evening continued, but everything felt different now. Richard found himself really listening to Michael's stories about school, about his friends, about the music he loved. He asked questions, real questions, about his son's interests and dreams. For the first time in years, they were having an actual conversation, not just Richard managing Michael's behavior. When the band announced their last song of the evening, Michael looked hopefully at his father. This time, Richard didn't hesitate. Standing up and offering his arm with the same formal courtesy his son had shown, he said, "Michael, would you teach me to dance?" The dance floor felt enormous as Richard followed his son's lead, trying to match Michael's natural rhythm and grace. He was clumsy at first, stepping on Michael's toes and apologizing profusely, but Michael just laughed and patiently corrected his father's footwork. "It's okay, Dad. Just feel the music. Don't think so much. Just let it move through you." Michael's advice was simple but profound, and gradually, Richard began to relax into the movement. For the first time in decades, he stopped thinking about who was watching, stopped worrying about appearances, and just experienced the moment. As they danced, Richard realized how much he'd missed. All those years of being embarrassed by Michael's enthusiasm, all those times he'd chosen his own comfort over his son's happiness. What had he been protecting? What was so important about the opinions of strangers that he'd sacrificed his relationship with his own child? "I'm sorry, Michael," Richard whispered as they swayed together. "I'm sorry for all the times I said no, all the times I made you feel like you weren't enough. You are more than enough. You're extraordinary." Michael's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy. "I love you, Dad. I always have, even when you seemed far away." The simple honesty of his son's words broke something open in Richard's chest, and he pulled Michael closer, dancing not just with his body, but with his whole heart for the first time in years. The other diners watched this second dance with even more emotion than the first. This wasn't just a dance, it was a reconciliation, a moment of healing that transcended their personal story and spoke to something universal about love, acceptance, and the courage to change. As the evening wound down, something remarkable began to happen. Other patrons approached their table, not with the pitying smiles Richard had always dreaded, but with genuine warmth and admiration. Mrs. Evelyn Blackwood, the wife of a prominent judge, stopped by to tell Michael how much she'd enjoyed his dancing. "You have a gift, young man," she said, her usual stern demeanor softened by genuine emotion. "My late husband would have loved to see you dance. He always said that true grace comes from the heart, not from technique." Michael beamed at the compliment, and Richard felt a surge of pride that was entirely new to him. Dr. Hernandez returned to their table with a business card. "Richard, I run a program for families dealing with developmental disabilities. We focus on celebrating abilities rather than focusing on limitations. I think you and Michael might be interested in some of our activities. We have dance classes, music therapy, all sorts of wonderful programs." Richard took the card, actually considering the possibility for the first time. Even the restaurant manager, James Morrison, came by to thank them. "In 30 years in this business, I've rarely seen anything as beautiful as what happened here. Tonight, your son brought something special to our dining room. He reminded all of us what joy looks like." He turned to Michael directly. "You're welcome here any time, young man. In fact, I hope you'll come back and dance for us again." Diane returned as they were preparing to leave, having finished her shift. She approached Michael first, giving him a gentle hug. "Thank you for asking me to dance. You've got real talent. And more importantly, you've got heart. Don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise." The car ride home was different from any Richard could remember. Instead of sitting in awkward silence or making stilted conversation, he and Michael talked easily. About the evening, about music, about dancing. Michael's excitement was infectious, and Richard found himself making plans, real plans, to spend more time with his son. "Dad, can we take dancing lessons together? Mrs. Chen knows a teacher who works with people like me." The phrase, people, like me, would have made Richard wince just hours ago, but now he heard it for what it was. Not a limitation, but simply Michael's way of acknowledging his place in the world without shame or apology. "I'd love that, son. And maybe we could go back to the restaurant next week? Make it a regular thing?" Richard was surprised by his own words, but even more surprised by how much he meant them. The thought of returning to a place where he'd felt so exposed just hours ago should have terrified him, but instead it filled him with anticipation. Michael clapped his hands with delight. "Really? We could be dance partners. Maybe Diane will be working and I can introduce you properly. She's really nice, Dad. She didn't treat me like I was different. She just treated me like Michael." The simple observation hit Richard like a thunderbolt. That's all Michael had ever wanted. To be treated like himself, not like a problem to be managed or a source of embarrassment to be hidden. How had it taken him 16 years to understand something so fundamental? As they pulled into their circular driveway, Richard made a decision. "Michael, tomorrow I want you to call Mrs. Chen and ask her about those dance lessons. And I want you to think about other things you'd like to do, things we could do together. I've missed too much of your life already." That night, Richard sat in his study looking at Dr. Hernandez's business card and thinking about the evening's events. On his desk were photos of Michael at various ages, birthday parties, school events, family gatherings. In every picture, Michael was smiling, radiating the same joy Richard had witnessed on the dance floor. How had he missed it for so long? He picked up his phone and before he could change his mind, called his assistant. "Sarah, I need you to clear my calendar for Saturday afternoons. Every Saturday, indefinitely. And can you research dance instructors in the area who have experience with special needs students? Yes, it's for Michael and Sarah. From now on, when Michael calls the office, put him through immediately, no matter what meeting I'm in." Tutter. Next morning, Richard did something he hadn't done in years. He had breakfast with his son. Not a rushed meal grabbed between phone calls, but an actual sit-down breakfast where they talked about Michael's plans for the day, his friends at school, his dreams for the future. "Dad," Michael said as they finished eating, "last night was the best night of my life. Not just because I got to dance, but because you saw me, really saw me. I've been waiting for that for a long time." The maturity in Michael's words stunned Richard and filled him with both pride and regret. Mrs. Chen, who had been with their family for 8 years, watched this interaction with tears in her eyes. She'd seen Richard struggle with accepting Michael's disability, had witnessed the distance between father and son grow wider with each passing year. Now, for the first time, she saw hope for real connection. "Mr. Richard," she said as she cleared the breakfast dishes, "Michael has been practicing his dancing every day after school. He wanted so much to make you proud." Richard felt another piece of his heart break open at the realization of how hard his son had been trying to connect with him all along. The following Friday evening, Richard and Michael returned to the Riverside Country Club. This time, Richard had called ahead to request the same table, and he'd specifically asked if Diane would be working. The maitre d' had seemed puzzled by the unusual request, but had accommodated it. Michael was practically vibrating with excitement as they walked into the dining room. The jazz ensemble was setting up again, and several diners from the previous week recognized them and offered friendly waves. The atmosphere felt completely different to Richard, welcoming rather than judgmental, warm rather than cold. Diane approached their table with a genuine smile, clearly pleased to see them return. "Well, if it isn't my favorite dance partner," she said to Michael, who beamed with pride. "I was hoping you'd come back. The band leader asked about you. He said he'd never seen anyone respond to music quite like you do." Richard stood as Diane approached, extending his hand. "I don't think we were properly introduced last week. I'm Richard Montgomery, and I owe you a tremendous debt of gratitude." The formality of his words couldn't hide the genuine emotion behind them. "Diane Johnson," she replied, shaking his hand. "And you don't owe me anything. That dance was as much a gift to me as it was to Michael. Sometimes we all need reminders about what really matters." Her words were simple, but Richard understood the deeper meaning. She had reminded him about the importance of love over image, connection over control. As the evening progressed, Richard found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't experienced in years. He asked Diane about her studies, learned about her dreams of becoming a pediatric nurse, discovered that she had a younger brother with autism who had taught her about seeing past disabilities to the person within. When the music began, Michael immediately asked Diane to dance, and she accepted with obvious delight. But this time, she also extended an invitation to Richard. "Would you like to join us? Michael told me you two have been practicing." The idea of dancing in public still terrified Richard, but the joy on his son's face gave him courage. What followed was one of the most awkward and wonderful experiences of Richard's life. He stumbled through the steps, laughed at his own mistakes, and gradually began to understand what Michael meant about feeling the music rather than thinking about it. Other couples joined them on the floor, and instead of feeling exposed, Richard felt part of something larger, a community of people choosing joy over self-consciousness. Dr. Hernandez appeared at their table during a break, accompanied by her husband and another couple. "Richard, I'd like you to meet Tom and Susan Mitchell. Their daughter Anna has Down syndrome, and she's in our dance program. She's about Michael's age." The introduction led to an hour-long conversation about parenting, about challenges and celebrations, about the unexpected gifts that come with raising children who see the world differently. By the end of the evening, Richard had exchanged phone numbers with 3 other families, had signed up for Dr. Hernandez's support group, and had committed to attending a fundraising gala for her program. More importantly, he had danced with his son in front of a room full of people and felt nothing but pride. As they prepared to leave, the band leader approached their table. "Excuse me, but I wanted to tell your son that he has natural musical ability. The way he moves to rhythm, the way he feels the music, that's rare. If he's ever interested in music lessons, I know some excellent teachers who specialize in working with special needs students." 6 months later, Richard's life looked completely different. His Saturday afternoons were dedicated to Michael. Sometimes dance lessons, sometimes music therapy, sometimes just hanging out and talking. He had joined Dr. Hernandez's support group and had become one of its most active members, using his business connections to raise funds and awareness for disability advocacy programs. The Riverside Country Club had become their regular Friday night destination, and Michael had developed a reputation as the club's unofficial dance ambassador. Other families had started bringing their children with disabilities, creating an inclusive community that surprised everyone with its warmth and acceptance. Diane had become more than just their waitress. She had become a friend. Richard had helped her with nursing school expenses, not out of charity, but out of genuine admiration for her dreams and her character. She often joined them for dinner after her shift, and her easy friendship with Michael had taught Richard even more about seeing past surfaces to the person beneath. The most dramatic change, however, was in Richard himself. His employees noticed that he smiled more, that he seemed more present in meetings, that he had developed a new interest in corporate social responsibility programs. He had established a foundation focused on disability advocacy and had begun speaking publicly about his journey as a father of a child with special needs. At the latest fundraising gala for Dr. Hernandez's program, Richard took the stage to address the crowd of donors and supporters. 6 months ago, I thought I knew what success looked like, he began, his voice steady and confident. "I measured it in dollars and deals, in acquisitions and achievements. I was wrong." "Success," Richard continued, looking out at the audience, "of prominent business leaders and socialites is watching your son light up a dance floor with pure joy. Success is learning to see past your own fears to embrace the extraordinary person your child already is. Success is discovering that what you thought was your child's limitation was actually your own." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. These were people who understood achievement, who had built empires and accumulated wealth, but Richard was speaking about a different kind of wealth entirely. "My son Michael has Down syndrome. For years, I let that diagnosis define not just how I saw him, but how I allowed others to see him. I was so concerned with protecting him from the world's judgment that I forgot to protect him from my own." Richard's voice wavered slightly, but he continued with growing strength. "But 6 months ago, a young woman named Diane Johnson reminded me what courage looks like. She asked my son to dance, and in doing so, she showed me that the barriers I'd built around Michael weren't protecting him. They were imprisoning both of us." The audience began to murmur with recognition and emotion. Michael was in the audience, beaming with pride at his father's words. Diane sat beside him, having been invited as their special guest. Dr. Hernandez nodded approvingly from the front row, remembering that first conversation at the restaurant. "Tonight, I'm asking you to do more than write checks. Though your financial support is crucial, I'm asking you to examine the walls you've built in your own lives, the assumptions you've made about what normal looks like, what success means, what beauty is." Richard's passion was evident, his transformation complete. The speech made local news, then national news. Video clips circulated on social media, and Richard found himself inundated with interview requests and speaking invitations. But more importantly, families across the country began reaching out, sharing their own stories of struggle and triumph, asking for advice and offering support. The Riverside Country Club started hosting monthly inclusion nights, where families with special needs children were especially welcomed. The events became so popular that other restaurants in the city began similar programs. What had started as one awkward evening had grown into a movement. Diane graduated from nursing school with honors and was immediately hired by the Children's Hospital where Dr. Hernandez worked. Her first assignment was to the Developmental Disabilities Unit, where her unique combination of medical knowledge and natural empathy made her invaluable to families navigating their children's diagnoses. Michael continued to thrive, not just in dance, but in all areas of his life. His confidence had blossomed along with his father's acceptance, and he had become something of a celebrity in their social circle, not as an object of pity, but as a young man whose joy and authenticity inspired everyone around him. Richard's business continued to prosper, but now it prospered with purpose. He had restructured his company's hiring practices to be more inclusive, had established mentorship programs for employees with disabilities, and had become a vocal advocate for accessibility in the business world. The foundation he'd established had grown beyond his wildest expectations, funding research, supporting families, and changing attitudes about disability across the country. But Richard knew that none of these achievements would have been possible without that one moment of connection on a restaurant dance floor. 1 year after that transformative evening, Richard and Michael returned to the Riverside Country Club for a special celebration. The restaurant was hosting an anniversary party for their Inclusion Night program, and the dining room was filled with families whose lives had been touched by what had started as a simple dance between a young man and a kind waitress. The jazz ensemble played, and the dance floor was alive with movement, children and adults with various disabilities dancing alongside their families and friends. What had once seemed impossible to Richard now seemed like the most natural thing in the world. Diane, now working as a pediatric nurse but still picking up occasional shifts at the restaurant, approached their table with a special surprise. "Michael, I have someone I'd like you to meet. This is my brother James, the one I told you about. He's been dying to meet the famous dancer I've heard so much about." James was 18, with autism, and shared his sister's warm smile. Within minutes, he and Michael were deep in conversation about music, discovering shared interests and forming an instant friendship. Richard watched this interaction with deep satisfaction, knowing that this connection, like so many others, had its roots in that first brave moment when Diane had asked his son to dance. As the evening progressed, Richard found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. Every challenge they'd faced, every breakthrough they'd celebrated, every moment of connection they'd shared could be traced back to that night when he'd finally seen his son not as a problem to be managed, but as a person to be celebrated. "Doctor." Hernandez took the microphone to address the crowd, her voice filled with emotion as she looked out at the diverse group of families celebrating together. "When we started this program, we hoped to create a few evenings of inclusion and acceptance. What we've created instead is a community, a family of families who understand that our differences make us stronger, not weaker." She gestured toward Richard and Michael's table. "It all started with one father's journey from fear to love, from embarrassment to pride, from isolation to community. Richard Montgomery's transformation reminds us that it's never too late to tear down the walls we've built and start building bridges instead." The applause was thunderous, but Richard barely heard it. He was watching Michael on the dance floor, now teaching James some steps while Diane looked on with obvious pride. This was what success looked like. Not the accumulation of wealth or power, but the multiplication of joy and acceptance. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Richard stood on the restaurant's terrace looking out at the city lights. Diane joined him, having finished her shift for the evening. "You know," she said quietly, "that first night, I almost didn't ask Michael to dance. I was worried about overstepping boundaries, about making you uncomfortable. I'm so glad I trusted my instincts instead of my fears." Richard turned to face her. This young woman whose simple act of kindness had changed everything. "I'm grateful every day that you did. You didn't just give Michael a dance. You gave us both a life. You showed me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting with love despite the fear." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the city spread out below them. Finally, Richard spoke again. "You know what the most remarkable thing is? None of this feels extraordinary anymore. Having Michael as my son, being part of this community, advocating for inclusion, it all feels like the most natural thing in the world. The extraordinary thing is that I ever thought differently." 5 years later, the Montgomery Foundation had become one of the leading advocates for disability rights in the country. Richard had testified before Congress, had been featured on major news programs, and had become a sought-after speaker on corporate social responsibility and inclusive hiring practices. But the measure of success that mattered most to him was much simpler. Michael was thriving. Now 21, he had graduated from high school, was taking college courses in music therapy, and had become a certified dance instructor specializing in working with people with disabilities. The shy, apologetic boy who had once begged his father for just one dance had become a confident young man who brought joy and healing to others through movement and music. Diane had married James Morrison, the restaurant manager who had been so moved by that first dance, and they had established their own nonprofit organization focused on inclusive recreation programs. She often told people that watching Michael dance had taught her about the power of seeing ability instead of disability, a lesson that had transformed her approach to nursing and to life. The Riverside Country Club had become a model for inclusive hospitality, hosting conferences and training sessions for other establishments looking to welcome families with special needs. The dance floor where it all began was now equipped with specialized lighting and sound systems to accommodate guests with various sensory needs. Richard's business empire continued to grow, but now it grew with purpose and consciousness. His companies were recognized leaders in inclusive employment practices, and his buildings were designed with accessibility as a core principle rather than an afterthought. Every decision was filtered through a simple question: how does this make the world more welcoming for people like Michael? But perhaps the most profound change was in the relationships within the Montgomery family. Richard and Michael had become true partners in advocacy, traveling together to speak at conferences and schools. Their bond, forged in that moment of shared vulnerability on a dance floor, had grown into something beautiful and unbreakable. Today, if you visit the Riverside Country Club on a Friday evening, you might see an older gentleman with silver hair, teaching a young man with Down syndrome some new dance steps. You might notice the easy affection between them, the way they laugh at shared jokes, the obvious pride each takes in the other's accomplishments. If you look closely, you might see a bronze plaque near the dance floor that reads, "In honor of all who choose courage over comfort, love over fear, and inclusion over isolation." The dance continues. The plaque was installed on the 5th anniversary of Inclusion Night, donated by the families whose lives had been changed by the program. Richard Montgomery, now 57, still runs a billion-dollar empire, but his greatest achievement walks beside him every day in the form of his son Michael. The man who once saw disability as a limitation now understands it as a different way of experiencing the world, often a more joyful, authentic, and connected way. The story that began with a reluctant father's embarrassment at his son's differences has become a testament to the power of transformation, the importance of acceptance, and the simple truth that we are all more alike than we are different. Michael still dances every Friday night, sometimes with his father, sometimes with Diane. When she visits, and often with new friends who have been touched by his infectious joy, he has taught hundreds of people to dance, but more importantly, he has taught them to see past their own limitations and embrace the full spectrum of human experience. The waitress who saw a lonely boy and chose kindness over indifference sparked a revolution that continues to spread. Diane, now Dr. Diane Morrison, runs a program at the Children's Hospital that uses dance and music therapy to help families connect across the boundaries of disability. Her simple act of asking a young man to dance has rippled outward, touching thousands of lives. And Richard. He learned that the greatest fortune he could ever accumulate was not in his bank account, but in the depth of his relationship with his son. The man who once measured success in dollars and acquisitions now measures it in moments of connection, in barriers broken down, in hearts opened to love. Every evening when they return home from their adventures, whether it's a dance lesson, a speaking engagement, or simply dinner at their favorite restaurant, Richard looks at his son and remembers that transformative night when a young black waitress named Diane Johnson changed their world forever. The dance floor at the Riverside Country Club continues to host its inclusion nights, welcoming families from all backgrounds and abilities. The music plays, couples sway together, and in the center of it all, the spirit of that first dance lives on. A reminder that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest acts of courage and kindness. In a world that often emphasizes differences, this story stands as proof that love, acceptance, and the willingness to see beyond surface appearances can transform not just individuals, but entire communities. The dance continues, and its rhythm beats with the hope that someday inclusion won't be special. It will simply be the way we treat each other every day, the legacy of one father's journey from shame to pride, from isolation to community, from fear to love, continues to inspire others to examine their own hearts and choose connection over comfort. And somewhere in the city tonight, another father watches his child with new eyes, another family discovers the courage to step onto their own dance floor, and another story of transformation begins. After all, We all have the capacity to change, to grow, to become better versions of ourselves. Sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to extend their hand and ask, "Would you like to dance?" The end. This story reminds us that true wealth lies not in what we possess, but in how we connect with others and embrace the full diversity of human experience. Every person deserves to be seen, valued, and celebrated for who they are, and sometimes all it takes is one moment of courage to change everything.